Hey everyone, it's Chad,
Hey, it's Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. All right, so to start off our second episode of our Modern Empire series, one of the biggest ones that we've been hyping up for I know a long time, we'd like to start our focus to go from what we last talked about from Greece and Alexander the Great onto Rome. Now, in our last episode, we touched really on Alexander the Great and his idea of a unity of mankind. We really harped on that this idea of his was one that wasn't new. It's not a novel idea for wanting a unity of mankind, but given that Alexander the Great was one of the most powerful people on the planet in the time and had this idea, it made it revolutionary because he not only had this idea, but he had the capability to bring it into action. And so by bringing this idea onto the main stage, it would inspire later generations of leaders, empires, countries, nations, states to pursue this idea of a sense of global unity. And one of the empires and the world leaders who would do this very soon after was Rome. And so in this episode, we'll be touching on Rome, which, as we noted in the last one, took on this idea of uniting the world, and in comparison to Alexander the Great, did so with much more success while not completely achieving it. You know, we're not living under a Roman Empire. It made a lot more progress in the mission of a global empire. And so, with that, we'll begin, and I'll hand it off to Khalil for some historical context.
So comparing Alexander the Great's Macedonian Empire and the Roman Empire, one thing that must be pointed out is that while Alexander had the ambitions of uniting mankind, and we'll get to the details of this later on, um, but like later on in another episode in this series, but his empire crumbled very quickly after his death, and it was because of a misjudged succession crisis of his. He did not very carefully think about who would succeed him afterwards, and he also died very young. But his empire very quickly collapsed, and so the traces of his empire aren't nearly as felt within the places that he conquered during his lifetime as they are, for example, in Rome or North Africa or the near Middle East for Rome. And so Rome, when you look at the idea of global unity, it of course did not conquer the whole world. And there was actually a point when they agreed and understood that their conquest was going to have to be limited to certain regions. That's why at a certain point in Roman imperial history, they started building walls. The first one being the Hadrian Wall at around the border between England and Scotland. And then they started like putting up very, very structured like border defenses along the Rhine River, the border between France and Germany, as well as along the Danube, carving through Central and Eastern Europe, as well as, like the border that they would have with the Parthians, the Persian Empire, on the in the Middle East around modern day Syria, as well as the Saharan Desert as a natural frontier down in the south. And so there was a point when the Romans basically agreed, you know what, we're not going to be able to continue expanding, whether it be because they faced stiff opposition the further that they went, or because of economic reasons, whatever. But what's interesting about Rome, and when you compare it to Alexander the Great and his Macedonian Empire, is that while it wasn't global in nature, their ability to grow from something very small to something very big, to unite people that they used to go to war with only a few years ago, and being part of this sense of what it was to be Roman and not Gallic or Swabian or Greek or or Italic or whatever, and to be Roman, to move out of tribal differences, because that's one thing that Rome needs to be given credit for, is that it moved Europe out of tribalism suddenly, and in a very different way than a lot of other places in the world. And this goes to say also for the near Middle East, like modern day Turkey and Syria, as well as the Levantine coast of modern day Israel, Jordan, and other nations, and even North Africa. Like everywhere that Rome was, there is this trace, not only of of certain infrastructure projects that they had, which again we'll go into later. There's also um, the idea that like that nations would be built and that those nations would not be under threat by certain tribal differences that you would have in other places in the world, whether they be native North America as well as South America and Africa, parts of Asia, Australia, and Europe just kind of developed differently because of Roman sense of unity. And so to begin, you know, because I just remembered I actually needed to mention this first, or at least at some point. Um, a good example of Rome's unity is in Spain. Now, Rome, it used to be just a city, Rome, and it continued to expand within the region around Rome and nearby rivers in a certain section of Italy, then growing to all of Italy, and then growing to take over the whole Mediterranean, and then much further beyond that. We'll see a map of Rome at its furthest extent later on in this episode. But once they started taking over Spain, there was a very interesting thing that happened. There was a civil war in the heart of the empire between two competing military leaders, Marius and Sulla. And eventually, I believe Sulla won, and he started purging the enemies of like the supporters of his enemy Marius, and one of the supporters being this guy called Sertorius. Now he fled over to unconquered Hispania, as it was known at the time, modern Spain and Portugal. And as he was over there, and he was kind of like hiding from persecution from Sullan forces, supporters of Sulla. He also started to gain respect from the native, I guess you could say, Hispanic peoples, Hispania, and he would gain a senior role amongst the tribal leaders, and he would begin to unite the people under what would become increasingly recognized as Roman customs. Now, the first example of this is that once he started to like set himself up as a high authority in Hispania and united all those tribal leaders, he began to assimilate them and integrate them into Roman culture um, by bringing all the children of his local warrior commanders, like fellow like military leaders, into an academy in his capital city that he raised up. And those children of his like fellow like warrior like military leaders would be brought in as hostages essentially to ensure good behavior on their part, and they'd be educated in Roman fashion, and they would promise, and then there would be promises brought over towards those children's parents, his local warrior military leaders, that it would lead to high administrative positions for them and their families under his rule, and then eventually when the Romans came. Um, and then also he the governance of this region was also very much in Roman style, even though it wasn't yet officially under Roman control. It was just him. He brought in a senate of local leaders, and he elected certain Roman positions, even by Roman names, caesters and praetors, to kind of govern certain areas within the province. And then and that's pretty much the way in how Sertorius, this guy, was able to unite the people. He was starting to teach some of the leaders Latin, and then it kind of trickled down from there. And so when his fight against the Romans eventually failed, and the Romans came and conquered Hispania, the Hispania was very much prepared for Roman rule. So that was a very complicated story right there. It involves a little bit of clarifications of allegiances, and also telling you about Roman unity in general and its comparison with Alexander the Great. But the Roman system of unity was through integration and assimilation. And we haven't even started about the infrastructure projects yet.
Absolutely. So with Rome, what you have as their center of unity is a unity essentially of civilization. It's a unity that is brought forth with the advancement of politics, infrastructure, which we'll get onto later, government, and law that brought order to a world of disorganized systems. As Khalil mentioned before, it was Roman influence throughout Europe that sort of brought them out of being very, very different tribes, clans, what would be called nations later on, into a sense of development that is much different than other places in the world. And it is through this idea of this unity that is brought forth of bringing forth things such as government and order that makes their sense of unity throughout Europe one that is different and goes on differently throughout the world. So when it comes back to Alexander the Great, we touched on how his idea of unity was um, bringing together all of mankind, bringing together mankind because they are the sons or the daughters, the children essentially of some sort of deity. Now we argued over which one that may be, and that's left to the theologians. But it is that idea of bringing together humanity is one that Rome took on. And as we touched on, they took on it at more of a sort of local sort of sense in the territories that they had. Rome brought together they brought to them their elected government, the Senate, just like we were talking about in what is modern day Spain. They brought to them a Senate. They brought to them new customs. They brought them infrastructure. They gave people who were under their rule an equal set, an organized set, a standardized set of things that would uplift them from what they could have been from hunter gatherers all the way to a more systemic production and an increased standard of living. It was this way of bringing up civilizations and giving them the ways to sometimes even manage themselves that Rome brought a new idea or built upon Alexander's idea of having a global unity, at least in the territories that they controlled.
Another thing I want to quickly look at is like we've already started talking, and we'll definitely get further on with the Roman sense of unity, and how they were able to standardize certain things that increased quality of life for those under their rule, or the majority of them, um, or the majority of their citizens. But we also want to talk about the like certain things that Rome is also known for. Rome is known for its military. There were a lot of reasons for why, if you were, you know, a native Gallic person, because France used to be known as Gallia, or if you were a native Dalmatian person, Pannonian person, Dacian person, Ratian person, Cappadocian person, there were certain benefits, whether you were a tribal leader, rebelling against the Romans, and accepting Roman rule, or being like maybe a guerrilla band against Roman authority. There were a lot of benefits to joining in this Roman system of of organization and civilization. Um, and the first that I want to point out is their legacy of military victory. So as you can tell, the Roman Empire, just from the name, started with just Rome. It started with just the city of Rome. And then as the centuries passed, they took over parts of Italy, and then a larger part of Italy, and then all of Italy, and then they took over, like some of the nearby coasts, and then they continued to expand and expand and expand to the point where they crossed the strait over here to Britannia, and the Bosphorus Strait over towards Asia, even as well as parts of North Africa. So you can tell that Rome was not a force to be trifled with. You might as well, pick Rome because there was an idea that Rome was always going to win, has this legacy of military victory. But then also, you can't bet against Rome. Even when they're hobbled, you can always get the idea from their military history that they're not going to lose or they're not going to take defeat. You know, the first example of this is the sack of Rome back around 400 BC. The city of Rome, which was mainly around the territory that was under Roman control back in 400 BC, it was not much further beyond the city limits at that time. An invading Gallic tribal force of many tens of thousands of men came and sacked the city, and the details of that story I'm not going to get into, but they responded to that. They grew, they got bigger. And even though, the sack of Rome was a really big traumatic event in Roman history for people in that era, as many thousands of Romans died, it was very humiliating. Within a few decades, they came back and returned the favor and burned their capital city, Mediolana. And then further on, you have the Punic Wars with what used to be the Carthaginian Empire, and that doesn't really show it on the map, but it used to be a very big power. But this part of North Africa, and as well as most parts of Spain, back when Rome was just Italy. So there was a point in where one of their very skilled generals, Hannibal, you might know him. He was known for crossing the Alps back in 218 BC. A couple years after that, after devastating defeats to Roman armies, tens of thousands strong, with with tens of thousands of deaths and other casualties in Roman armies at a time when the Italian population, because again, that's mainly the territory that Rome had control over at this time, was a lot smaller than it is now. It was a big deal. And then considering, back from the episode with Dr. Hansen and Alex, that the qualifications for people to be part of the army were a lot smaller then. This was a really big crisis for Rome. And at their particular battle, in Italy called the Battle of Cannae, um, Hannibal, with a smaller force of 50,000, was able to defeat a Roman army of 85,000, by surrounding them and killing 70,000. The remaining 10, 15,000 ran off, most of them injured, running off the battlefield to tell the Roman Senate that basically Hannibal was coming. Now, Hannibal didn't decide to take Rome, but he could have. And that was a very scary thing to the Roman people. Now, it was partially, as historians still debate this today, but it was because of that hesitancy, that belief in Hannibal that he couldn't take Rome, that Rome was able to again, you know, just brush that shit off, and get back to it. And then eventually, 15 years later, they weakened the Carthaginian Empire and Hannibal himself to such a point that they would never recover. So, and that's just a couple examples. I don't have enough time to go into the bigger ones, but there have been times in Rome's history, even when it was still powerful, and then it would continue at some points, even into the Roman imperial era, past the Pax Romana, during the third century crisis, I think it was called, when Rome was just beaten, shook, slapped around by native tribes, by plague, but still came back. So if you are living in Rome, or if you are living in any nearby area, you're thinking, oh, it might be bad right now, but I'm never going to turn against Rome.
Exactly. And thank you again for the historical kind of analysis and the map too, so we could have a view of where this stuff is going on. But as we get back to our main sort of center of this episode, we've shown Rome had an empire. It wasn't just them in Italy. So in the territories that they would have a vast control of, there is a need for not having these people revolt. There's a need for not having these people not pay their taxes or anything to that sort. And so, as an empire, as a government, you have to figure out a way in order to persuade these people on your side, unless you would like to be fighting an insurrection for the next 20 years. And so the way that Rome did this was through uplifting and having these conquered territories essentially become partners in their establishment of their empire. They gave them privileges, they gave them government, they gave them policies, they gave them law, and will even as we will talk about, they gave them infrastructure. They the Roman Empire through pursuit in the sense that they wanted a global unity. It was more so a localized unity, a unity within the territory that they held, because as we described, it would get to a certain point where you realize you can't take over the world. So you might as well just focus on what you got. And that's essentially what Rome did. They made an organized society, a unified organized society throughout their empire in an effort to bring together the peoples that were in other times would be seen as their lowers. And again, this harkens back to Alexander the Great, a desire for the people under his global unity to be seen as his partners and not as his lowers. This participation in government that Rome was able to bring to its vast amount of territories in order to give them a standard way of living is one way that you have people, one, support your empire, and two, live a common way of life and essentially bring a unity to places from Spain all the way to the Middle East in a way that had not happened before. It was a sort of revolutionary idea, just as Alexander the Great's very notion of a global unity that Rome was able to put into in a smaller small scale besides the entire planet. It was able to put this into actuality. Rome brought an order to a world of chaos. It brought order, you'd say even peace, to a world of chaos and anarchy, which, might sound familiar if you watched our series on peace and freedom. But from there, we'll go and talk about the ways that Rome sort of brought this unity. And some of the ways that it would do so would be through the extension of Roman citizenship, which, in brief, um, say if you compare it to American citizenship, sometimes it's born, sometimes it's given, but that's now. Back in the times of Rome, it was much different. And I'm sure, Khalil, you can add in a lot more of the greater context. But in brief, Rome, throughout their history, extended their citizenship to not just citizens of what would be Italy or their sort of territory there, but to some, and later in the day, all adults. And I'll let you kind of go off of that, Khalil.
Right. Roman citizenship expanded from what was very tiny, like very tiny, to again, as we'll say about the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, to the entire empire. But Roman citizenship used to be reserved for the high elite of the city of Rome itself, and then it expanded to adults within Rome, and then it expanded to the region within Rome, and then it took until around 90 BC when the Romans, after a revolt from certain Italic allies, that they would give Roman citizenship to all Roman and Italic adults, but only to those that didn't revolt against the Roman state, because Roman elites didn't trust insurrectionists. Um, so they extended, their rights as time went on. But of course they were very worried about instability, and so they didn't give too much of benefits for those that disrupted the peace of the state. And then 300 years later, during Roman imperial times, and in the midst of the third century crisis, after the Pax Romana, with still 200 to 300 years of Roman imperial authority existing afterwards, during the Edict of Caracalla, it expanded to an extent when the Roman emperor gave full citizenship to all adults within the Roman Empire, with very few exceptions. And again, former insurrectionists, they would not be part of they would not be part of the Roman territory. They would not be part of the Roman citizenship electorate bloc. But again, you could see like the continued extension of Roman citizenship, which it is very important to see how they were going to like bring in people that otherwise would have been part of tribes that have a memory, a familiar memory of being hurt by the Romans, of being conquered by the Romans. That now, as the generations go by, and you might have fathers, grandfathers, mothers, grandmothers, from older generations telling the people of, let's say, modern day Spain or modern day Mauritania or modern day Libya or modern day Bosnia, and they're saying, don't trust the Romans, they'll take things from you. But then the Romans are saying, no, we'll give you citizenship, we'll give you infrastructure projects, we'll give you relatively secular politics. You can have your own freedom of religion, but you must pay homage to Roman gods. We'll give you legal institutions, we'll give you benefits to those that join our forces. And they're going to be thinking, well, why wouldn't I conform with this Roman authority? And so that's like a sort of way in how the Roman Empire, through its own system of empire, was able to incentivize um, conformity and incentivize unity. Because again, as we talk about with peace v freedom, people have this tendency to want to fight. And so the with the Roman system, with their military power, they had this mindset that it's kind of like these barbarians, the people that are beyond Rome's borders that aren't Roman, and the idea of what was Roman would continue to expand with time has gone on, as we already mentioned. But the people that weren't Roman, the idea through a military sense, which Rome was very much excelled in at the time, was that the barbarians only understand violence. And so again, it's a very pessimistic idea. Um, and uh, um, and then you could see that with their brutality on the battlefield. But as the years go on, um, the administrators, the governors, the politicians of Rome had a different mindset. While they still might have had a superiority complex between them and the barbarians, again, the idea of who was a barbarian was like limited itself with time as time went on, and who was Roman expanded beyond people that weren't just within the city of Rome, weren't just within the area around Rome, weren't just within the province of Italia, to the entire empire. To the point when Roman politicians and Roman governors and leaders, after a few years after military conquest, would go around and say, you know what? Before we have this positive pessimistic idea that the barbarians only understand violence, but now that we are ruling over these people, it's best for the ability to keep the peace within our territory, to give these people rights, to give these people no reason to revolt. And so that's what they did. And then we move on to infrastructure projects. We have public baths, theaters, public squares, circuses, aqueducts, roads, bridges, etc. And then they also, as I already mentioned, relatively secular politics, you know, at least compared to like other legal systems of the time. They would run by logic, and not necessarily by the God's divine will, because they understood that if they ran entirely and based their entire like real world governing legal system upon their own Roman religion, then there would be revolts against that from other parts of the world, from other parts of their territory, because there were different religions as they knew within their territory. And so they had a relatively secular politics for the time and a freedom of religion for those to practice. Now, as time went on, they would have their own group with Jewish people during the Great Jewish Revolt, but that's a topic for another day. In general, like the people, they could have their own freedom of religion, which was again a very unifying factor. Um, but they must pay homage to Roman gods, and that was going to be the way and how people united. Now, this is how you end up getting to this problem with the Romans towards Jewish people and towards early Christians, is that they, according to their own religion, did not allow themselves to submit to other pagan gods. And so that's when you go into the whole like problem right there. But there were other benefits that the Romans would give like their people that would earlier be considered barbarians. And when I was talking about those infrastructure projects being the public baths, theaters, public squares, circuses, aqueducts, roads, bridges, and more, one thing to point out is that that wasn't just within a few cities, or wasn't just within Rome or Constantinople. it was within like every city of the empire, which as you can see right here, just about every dot here that isn't like the name of some territory or province is like describing a city with just about those qualities, maybe some with a little less, maybe some with a little more, but all of them with a certain level of comfort. And as you
Mm,
can see, like it's not just, within Europe, not just within Italy, it's spread around. We would have this modern projection, this modern conception of an idea that, the Italians being like Europeans or certain white people, that they would discriminate against other people from the Middle East or Africa. When, as you can see here, there are many cities and places that weren't Europe, and they were just about as equally developed. So Romans really did have this interesting sense of unity that people might not be able to understand now with certain modern projections.
yeah. The infrastructure is always a really interesting one because when you look in modern day, infrastructure is one way how you could see vastly different gaps and vastly different experiences for different people in the same country. Look at the United States. The infrastructure that exists in, say, California is vastly different than what you'll be finding in, say, Idaho. You're not going to have as many, say, freeways or as many grocery stores or as many even pharmacies, just given the population differences, the government spending, the different priorities of the two states, and other things to that sort, and the difference between those two states. And so, as citizens of each, you might feel like that what you live in here in, say, in California feels like a completely different country than what it would feel like to be living in Idaho. Now, with the Roman Empire, by giving this standardization of these really advanced infrastructure projects for the time, such as aqueducts, roads, bridges, public squares, theaters, it brings a sense of unity in that wherever you go within the empire, from Spain to Constantinople to the all the way down the Nile River to Britain, if you were to go to these different places, you'd see a commonality. You would see something that ties them together. Infrastructure is a very important way that does that because it impacts the normal person's way of living. And so if people from throughout the empire can feel that they live in a similar way to those on the other side of the empire or those within the central of the empire, those in the capital, it gives them a sense that we are part of the same country or the same government or under the same rule, that they don't neglect us like they do the other people, which would be something that would be a very easy motivation to pull each other apart. But Rome's way of unity, of bringing a standardization of the advancements of technology, really, is a way that brings so much, the vast amount of Europe, um, North Africa, Middle East, it brings their empire together. It brings a sense of unity that where we live, how we live, the customs that we practice, the rights that we have, and the freedoms that we are given to express within the constraints, of course, of the government are things that are shared and not spread inequitably throughout the empire. It gives you a sense of unity and it gives you a sense of togetherness, even. And that was something that the Roman Empire, unlike Greece or like the aspirations of Alexander the Great, but not exactly up to the execution of them, Rome was able to take Alexander's aspirations and put them into practice. It brought this unity, this common respect, and this common giving of rights and of course the infrastructure projects would bring the people together.
Yeah, as I'm making a couple notes of things that I forgot to mention, but like Jim Crow, that is a very interesting example for people that aren't able to get a good conception of this idea of the importance of infrastructure in uniting people.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Crow in the South for Black people was a really good example of how infrastructure, can be used to unite or to split people apart. You've heard of the term separate but equal. That was used to justify Jim Crow in the South, in America. But as we all know, it wasn't equal. My grandfather, my pawpaw, he has an eighth grade education because in Mississippi there weren't any high schools for Black people, and so you have an example of how infrastructure can be used to weaponize disunity, or for the case of Rome, to improve unity. If you feel again, as you said, Chad, that that as a person living in Egypt or modern day Sudan, that you're in the same position as someone living in modern day Ukraine or Russia, or someone living in Turkey or Syria, or to Italy or Germany, or to Britain, or to Portugal, then you're going to feel like, okay, why would I revolt? They're giving me everything I want here, you know. And then another thing that we need to point out is that a lot of this infrastructure, like roads as a good example, as one of them, they would continue to be used for centuries after Rome fell. It was only until maybe like the Renaissance and a bit afterwards that roads would be rebuilt, from the Roman ones, because they just lasted for so long. They were so well built, and they were so navigable, and and uh, um, and there were so many of them that intersected between many of these cities over here. The Romans were just really good at uniting their people. When it came to using their infrastructure as a way of developing areas so that people wanted to be part of it. Another thing I also wanted to point out is that, not just like the infrastructure of the roads, and a lot of infrastructure, that was developed by the Romans was kind of killed off during the early times of the Middle Ages, but because of war and Germanic settlement, which was very violent at the time, Hunnic invasions, but the roads, as an example, they lasted, as well as the cities themselves. Like, look at Londinium. That's modern day London. That was a Roman city. Um, Eburacum, I believe that is Manchester. Maybe I know that is a Birmingham, I think it is actually. And then you have Lutetia, that's modern day Paris. You have Massilia, that's Marseille. This city, Mediolanum, not to be confused with Mediolanum over here, that's modern day Milan. This is modern day Bordeaux. Oh, no, 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 no. Vertigala, this is modern day Bordeaux. So you have these ancient cities that, as time went on, modern day cities would build on them, like Rome, of course. Neapolis, that's modern day Naples, and then Athene, yeah, that was a Greek city. Athens built on that. But you have all these old cities, Brundisi, modern day city, that would be built and developed because of Roman presence. Unlike Alexander, and there are still settlements, there are still like towns that Alexander founded that grew and are a good lasting proof of Macedonian existence. Like Alexandria, for example, Alexander built that city, and his general Ptolemy, who would build his own dynasty in Egypt, further developed that city. But Rome was planted its presence into the psyche of the people who live in the territory that they once controlled, in a way that Alexander never did. Not because he wasn't able to, but because he got unlucky. He conquered all the territory, then died without a successor, and so his empire fell. But as you can see, Rome planted a legacy in the area that it controlled that wasn't easily forgotten. There's a reason why we talk about Rome so much. The roads, the cities, the way of government, everything. It's crucial to talk about Rome.
Exactly.
Like,
Civilization. Oop,
actually, another city that I just
another one.
found. there's a lot of cities here,
Many.
like cities that are now modern day cities, like um Trapezus, this is Trabzon, Byzantium, that's modern day Istanbul, Chersonesus, that's modern day Sevastopol. So, that's just, you know.
Yes. So as we've been saying, there's a reason we still talk about Rome to this day. And it's that they plant, as Khalil said, they planted themselves in the psyche of modern day Europe, but not just Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. They planted themselves throughout this continent, really, because of the unity that they brought. They did not restrict themselves simply to Rome or to Italy and leave all their rights to themselves and left everyone else as their subjects. The Roman view of unity was one that viewed its people as its partners. It gave these people that it governed the mutual benefits that those in Rome could share with those living in Egypt, those living in Spain, in Britain, in modern day Ukraine. It gave the benefits of civilization, the benefits of order, the benefits of technology, of rights, of law, of politics, infrastructure. It gave them the ways to uplift themselves, and it gave them on a standard level. And through this way, it brought people together because it made one feel from someone all the way in Spain to feel that they are in the same empire as someone all the way in Turkey. This way of unity, which was built off of that of Alexander the Great's idea of a global unity due to the mutual respect deserved by mankind, Rome brought that into actuality. And while not on the scale of conquering the entire planet, they brought it in the scale of those who lived under their empire. And so with that, that is how Rome basically accentuated their view of global unity throughout the world.
Another thing I wanted to point out is that Rome adored Greek culture. It adored, certain customs, certain governing principles, but then also as they would look back at Alexander the Great, there were many Alexandrophiles. There were many people that looked at Alexander the Great and his cosmopolitan ideas and his ideas of global unity, and people wanted to reflect that. People wanted that. And so when you had Alexander being like one of very few people, even within his army, that wanted to treat his conquered peoples with respect, because his closest advisors were telling him, no, no, they are your lessers. We need to treat them as such. They are barbarians. Why are we like adopting their customs like out of respect for them? They're weaker than us. We beat them. They're barbarians. Why are we doing this? And Alexander had a vision that they just didn't. And so when Rome came around, and Rome actually already existed during the time of Alexander the Great, but it was small. And as it continued to grow, um, there were people like Plutarch, who we already mentioned last episode, who's actually a Roman historian. He did a lot of his research at around 200 AD, or like during Roman times, like so hundreds of years after Alexander, during Roman era times. He adored Alexander. He believed that very similar to Alexander, that Rome should adopt an idea of cosmopolitanism, where they would respect and developed the people of other areas and the areas themselves that those other people lived in to bring about a certain sense of unity within the realm. And Poppy Magnus, he was more of a military leader, but he also appreciated Alexander for his global conquest, the idea of connecting lands. So anyway,
Yeah. And so with that, Rome essentially brought the ideas of Alexander the Great into reality. And in their limited sense of those under their government, under their empire, they gave them a sense of global unity that would be followed on by later empires. And the next one that we'll be talking about in our next episode or episodes will be the Catholic Church. this was an empire which is not always traditionally viewed as an empire, given that it was a religion. But as we'll talk about in our next few the next episode or so, we'll talk about its power, its version of global unity, and how far it went in comparison to some of these past empires and the ones upcoming. So yeah, with that, we bring this little mini part of our modern empire to a close. I'm Chad,
I'm Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you in the next one.